If you are listening to this podcast, I imagine you love a good rabbit hole, especially when it's related to a disappearance or a long unsolved cold case. Today, I want to talk about how I learned about some of the crimes that I've researched for this podcast. Spoiler alert, it includes a true crime notebook I've created and often turn to for ideas. There is much to love about North and South Carolina, but the two states have also had their fair share of violent and senseless crimes over the years. From murders on the Blue Ridge Parkway, in the heart of big cities or sleepy college towns, and along the coastal waters, some of these stories may be new to you. Some may have happened in your town. Some may involve people that are still missing to this day. But all will leave you remembering to always be vigilant about the people you meet and the places you go. I'm Renee Robertson. Please join me for Missing in the Carolinas. Episode 136, Down the True Crime Rabbit Hole. I have one of those journals I got as a gift with a positive affirmation stamped on the front cover in cursive. It tells me how beautiful, smart, and talented I am, and says I am going to do amazing things. But if you open the notebook, you might be surprised at what you find scribbled on the pages. This journal has become my true crime notebook. The first page has a post-it note where I've written, NCSC John and Jane Does. A note, no doubt, I wrote as it came to me, and I didn't have the notebook nearby. The opening pages hold the original outline for my true crime podcast, which you're now listening to, Missing in the Carolinas, along with ideas for the first 4 episodes. I have domain name ideas for the eventual corresponding website, marketing surveys, and merchandise items. I've jotted down notes from various episodes of true crime shows and documentaries. Most of the time, my entries are brief, as I'm usually writing them down before I forget, amid working on something else. What happens a lot of the time is that I'm scanning archives for articles on a specific case and come across another interesting story about a missing person or crime. For example, while researching one case, a news brief in an old newspaper article caught my eye, and I wrote down, Murder solved in Flat Rock. 16-year-old Pamela Denise Durham was shot and killed by a former Broadway performer, 64-year-old Wilton Clary. This interested me because of the Broadway performer part and the age difference between the perpetrator and the victim. Plus, being from Western North Carolina, I know Flat Rock is a very small area where you wouldn't expect a murder like this to take place. I had to learn more. Curiosity about this case turned into episode 85, Denise Durham, Shelby Wilkie, and Marissa Carmichael. The news articles led me down a path that told more of the story but still left unanswered questions. I couldn't find any interviews with anyone in Denise's life that knew her to be in love with her voice instructor, Wilton McClary. He was, at the time, a well-respected and married man in the town of Flat Rock who ran and managed the iconic Flat Rock Playhouse and also operated a thrift store tied to the Humane Society. This crime divided the community and still left many, including myself, with unanswered questions years later. If I ever lost this notebook and someone outside of my family picked it up, I have a feeling they would be intrigued and hopefully not horrified. But my true crime notebook has never let me down. When I'm having a day where I'm not sure what to write about next on my blog or need ideas for a podcast script, I can flip open the notebook, scan it, and quickly have 2 or 3 ideas. I've mentioned it before, but I get a lot of my ideas from old newspaper archives. Unfortunately, missing persons cases don't receive a lot of media coverage, especially in decades past. So most of what I find in the archives are detailed accounts of crimes, arrests, and potentially criminal trials. This was how I discovered the topic for episode 121, the 1981 murders of Edward Doc Harkless, Ralph Felder, Maxlinia Likes, and Leroy Hemphill. I was researching another South Carolina cold case, and unfortunately I can't remember which one now, but the headline involving a root doctor murder jumped out at me because that's not something you see every day. I had to know more. And the more I read, the more questions I had. What kind of services did this root doctor, Edward Doc Harkless, provide to members of the Columbia, South Carolina community? One article cited members of law enforcement saying how the house, which was a well-maintained home in an otherwise rundown neighborhood, as containing voodoo literature and other occult items. The other thing that stood out to me was the 5 victims, besides Doc Harkless. Their housekeeper, Maxlinia Likes, was pregnant at the time of the murders. His wife was also in the home, and at age 39, there was quite an age discrepancy between her and Doc. His wife ended up surviving the shooting and required round-the-clock security, as well as 57-year-old Fletcher Felder, who also lived. In my research, I never learned why Ralph Felder, age 27, who died from his injuries, and later his father, Fletcher, were at the home. Another question I have is why Leroy Hemphill, a 52-year-old truck driver, was also there. In some reports, it appeared the men might have been there to purchase products from Doc Harkless, as he sold chicken and geese as well as herbs and potions, but how they all came to be gathered in the home at the same time remains a mystery. The three men eventually convicted of the murders, Charles Livingston, Willie Stroman, and Frank McDowell, all seemed to know Doc Harkless often kept large amounts of cash in his home and were motivated by greed. I don't think, however, that they expected so many people to be in the home when they carried out the robbery. And sometimes you just don't have answers no matter how much research you do. In this instance, the public never found out who pulled the trigger on Doc Harkless, who was the first victim. The men convicted had conflicting versions of what really happened in that house. In episode 119, the 1933 South Carolina murders of Mary Ravenel and Hubbard Harris Jr., my intention was to only research Mary Ravenel. When you do a general search on South Carolina cold cases, Mary's story often comes up because it was never solved. I found it interesting because she was an older socialite who was shot in the middle of the street. At first, passersby thought she had been hit by a car, but then a doctor discovered a bullet wound once she arrived at the hospital. Mary was murdered on November 1st, 1933, but the newspapers continued to report on her death over the next month, and that's where I stumbled across a news article about Hubbard Harris Jr., the 15-year-old who had gone missing a few days before Christmas. The fact that he was the son of a prominent businessman in Columbia made it stand out even more. If I hadn't been looking at these old editions of South Carolina newspapers from the 1930s, I'm not sure I would have ever learned about the abduction and murder of Hubbard Harris Jr. It's not one of those stories, like Mary Ravenel's, that has a large digital footprint. This research also illustrated how prevalent crime stories, regional, national, and international, were on the front pages of the newspapers. For example, on the front page of the January 14, 1934 edition of the Roanoke Times, the paper reported Hubbard Harris Jr.'s murderer, Robert Wiles, received the death penalty and would die in the electric chair. The same edition also ran a news brief about 11 guinea pigs carrying tuberculosis that were stolen from a research department at Emory Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. Another article that caught my eye had the headline, "Hypnotic Powers Tested in Court Cause Commotion." It's a short but humorous brief out of Chicago, Illinois, so I'll read it to you. Judge Rudolph Dusort's court was thrown into more or less commotion today by an impromptu alleged hypnotic seance. Mrs. Faye Boussow, divorced schoolteacher, had obtained December 9th a temporary injunction restraining her former husband, Ernest W. Boussow, health restaurateur, from hypnotizing her. "He hypnotized me into marrying him," she testified, "into obtaining a divorce and into giving him my savings in an unfair property settlement." Attorney Stephen Love, Boussow's attorney, laughed heartily and said Boussow couldn't hypnotize anyone. "Well, then tell him to count to 5, Mrs. Boussow challenged. He did so, and her head tipped back, her eyes rolled, and her mouth opened. The woman leaped from the witness stand and ran to her former husband, tagging him around the courtroom until the recess was ended. "What's your name?" asked the judge. "Crystal," responded the woman. "Faye is my conscious self. Faye and Crystal go to school together, but Crystal never stays there." The judge indicated he would continue his injunction and ordered all parties, including Faye-Crystal, to go home. Before we continue, let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. I had been unhappy with my old podcast host for a while and was looking for other options. I discovered Riverside FM and learned that for one low monthly fee, it would help me record the podcast and utilize video capabilities. It uses AI technology to easily create clips from each episode that I can share on my social media accounts. I don't consider myself very tech savvy, but audio and video editing with Riverside FM software has been a breeze, and I look forward to recording days now. If you are looking for a company that will help you with all your podcasting, webinar, and video needs, I encourage you to check out Riverside FM. You won't be disappointed. I'll include a link for you in the show notes. There are a lot of trends floating around on social media on the best way to keep your skin looking hydrated and youthful. But I don't like to follow fads, especially when I find a product that works. Enter the products from SkinxErin. I use her pre-cleanse oil, hydrating beauty oil, and perfecting night oil, and I was hooked from the first drops. The pre-cleanse gently removes dirt, impurities, and even waterproof makeup without tugging, all without stripping or drying out your skin. In addition to keeping your skin clear, it also helps your skin feel firmer and reduces the signs of aging. The hydrating beauty oil is a powerful and effective skin hydrator that never leaves your skin feeling greasy. The signature squalene oil is known for its anti-inflammatory and anti-aging properties. It's perfect for treating skin conditions like acne and eczema and reducing the appearance of wrinkles. The Perfecting Night Oil is loaded with vitamins E and A and is rich with antioxidants and omegas that nourish skin, replenish elasticity, and reduces stretch marks. A few drops a day leave skin smoother, more vibrant, and youthful. My skin instantly drinks in these oils, and I have never had a problem with them leaving residue on my clothes or sheets at night, only giving me a healthy glow that my husband often compliments me on. In fact, he's even been known to steal the bottles on my bathroom counter for himself. Want to try out the products? Go to shopxerin.com and use the code MissingCarolinas10 for a 10% discount on your order. And now, let's get back to the show. Another way my True Crime Notebook helps me put together episodes is when I'm looking to share several stories under one theme. For example, this past October, I wanted to put a show together involving domestic violence. Several months ago, I was searching through some old back issues of the Myrtle Beach Sun News. I came across an article describing how a young mother named Mary Ann Willis was murdered by her husband on the Myrtle Beach Air Force Base. I wrote down her name, knowing I wanted to come back to it later. When I was thinking about the domestic violence episode, I found her name in my notebook and went back and began collecting articles. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, this is truly a tragic story of a woman who was trying to do everything right and leave her abusive husband legally. He still murdered her, gunning her down in the legal affairs office of the Air Force Base. One thing I've learned from going down these rabbit holes is that the research I find can end up being helpful to surviving family members. I have a blog called finishedpages.com where I share shorter versions of true crime stories from the podcast. I also put transcripts from the podcast each week on the website for the show, missinginthecarolinas.com. A few weeks ago, I got an Instagram message from the son of Mary Ann Willis. He was only 6 years old when his mother was killed. He thanked me for sharing her story and for finding out so many details because he didn't know a lot of what I shared in the episode. Mary Ann's son said his stepfather was even crueler than anyone knew, and that he himself witnessed several instances of abuse in their household. I think this message highlights the importance of being an ethical true crime podcaster as well. You never know when a family member or friend might be listening, so I try to be mindful in the way I share facts about cases and leave out commentary that could be viewed as salacious or distasteful. I've also been surprised by the number of comments I get on my blog. Just recently, I created a blog post out of the unsolved murders of Pamela Murray and Beverly Sherman from Asheville. I shared their stories in episode 54. A reader named Teresa commented on the post and said this: "I've been wondering about the Murray case for years. I was curious if they'd ever caught the killer, and that's how I found your story. So much time has passed. I wonder if they will ever find the killer now. She was a relative of a friend of mine." I went down a few other rabbit holes this past summer with episode 98, Carolina Crimes from the 1950s and 60s. One day, when I was flipping through my true crime notebook, I found an entry that read, "John Paul Anderson convicted of murdering his wife, Brenda Lee Anderson." From the Charlotte Observer, August 2nd, 1965, article headline, "Hearing set in South Carolina drowning." Underneath that, I had written the names of several people murdered in Chapel Hill, including a woman named Lucille Rinaldi. Once I began compiling articles about those crimes, I became more and more intrigued. I think the thing that interested me most about those two cases is how differently they ended. Lucille and Frank Rinaldi were having marital issues and had been living apart, she in Connecticut, he in Chapel Hill, while he was teaching and working on a graduate degree. The two seemed to be struggling to save their marriage because Lucille was 5 months pregnant. He went shopping with an acquaintance on Christmas Eve of 1963, and when he returned a few hours later, Lucille had been murdered in their apartment. Police arrested Frank a few days after her murder, but he was released from custody because a judge ruled any circumstantial evidence police had found was insufficient to find probable cause. They went back to work, collected more evidence, including the discovery that Frank had purchased 2 life insurance policies from the acquaintance he'd been with when Lucille was murdered, and arrested him again in the summer of 1964. A jury was deadlocked on his guilt, and Frank Rinaldi was acquitted of any involvement having to do with his wife and unborn child's death. The death of Brenda Sue Anderson from South Carolina was just as fascinating, and also involved a squirrely husband, if you ask me. Brenda had only been married to John Paul Anderson for a few months when he decided to take her out in the water on Folly Beach for a lesson with scuba diving equipment. He then allegedly left her in the water floating on a life raft, and her deceased body washed up on the shore a few hours later. No sign of a raft was ever found, and lo and behold, John Paul had taken out a $50,000 life insurance policy on his wife. The autopsy showed bruising on her arms where she may have been held down under the water. John Paul Anderson was arrested for murder, and witnesses who testified did not paint the man in a good light. He was a philanderer and a pathological liar. The jury at first remained deadlocked, then came back and convicted him of murder. So unlike Frank Rinaldi, he was convicted of his wife's murder, but he did eventually receive parole and was released from prison about 10 years later. I never would have known about either one of these mysterious deaths had I not been scrolling through news archives from the 1960s. These older cases are even more interesting because of the way they were covered in the news. The Daily News in New York ran a lengthy article about Lucille Rinaldi's murder titled, "Murder at Chapel: How Could the Part-Time Instructor Murder His Wife While on a Shopping Tour?" These articles about John Paul Anderson all mentioned a sailor being charged with drowning his wife, so of course those caught my eye as well. I'll admit some rabbit holes are more disturbing than others, but I think it's important to keep the information out in the public. I went down quite the rabbit hole when I finally took a closer look at the Michael and Kathleen Peterson case from Durham. When the Max series starring Toni Collette and Colin Firth came out, I was inspired to watch the Netflix documentary The Staircase. Then I went back and read the old news reports from Kathleen's death, the arrest of Michael Peterson, and his subsequent 2 trials. This is one of those cases I feel like people who live in North Carolina talk about all the time, and that's understandable. I even found myself leaning more into the theory that an owl attacked Kathleen Peterson in her yard before she went inside their house on the night she died. There are just so many variables to the story that I can understand why Michael Peterson's defense attorney worked so long on his appeal. This is one of those cases where the defendant did a lot of things that raised eyebrows in his community, such as admitting to same-sex relationships while still married to Kathleen, and having a female acquaintance die of a similar fall down the stairs in Germany in 1985. Yet there was also a lot of reasonable doubt when you looked at the entire story. The Michael Peterson story is one where you could be in a room full of people, and every single person you asked about it would have a differing opinion on his guilt or innocence, or what they think really caused Kathleen Peterson's death. If you are a White Lotus fan, you'll also notice a lot of similarities between the Ratliff family from Durham in the latest season and the Peterson blended family. Both Michael and Kathleen Peterson were Duke University graduates, and he adopted Elizabeth Ratliff's 2 daughters after her death in Germany. So even the Ratliff name was present in the show, even if director and writer Mike White spelled it differently. If you haven't listened, I discussed this case at great length in episodes 43 and 44 of the podcast. Episode 35, The North Carolina Murders of Victor Gunnarsson and Catherine Miller and the Crimes of William Dathan Holbert, also sent me down a few different rabbit holes. In the early 1990s, a woman named Kay Whedon from Salisbury met and began a relationship with a man named Lamont Claxton, who went by the nickname LC. He worked in law enforcement. At first, everything was going well, and they became engaged, but LC became possessive, jealous, controlling, and tried to dictate the way Kay parented her teenage son from a previous relationship. LC took disability from work after suffering a back injury, and Kay decided she wanted to separate. Lamont began stalking her, though, and did not want her dating other people. The intriguing part of the story is when Kay began dating a Swedish man named Victor Gunnarsson. Victor had been a suspect in his country when their prime minister was assassinated in February of 1986. While charges against him were eventually dropped, he made his way to the United States, specifically Salisbury, to start over. He sounded like an interesting character. But in December of 1993, after dropping Kay off from a date, he disappeared. He was later found dead in Watauga County, the victim of a homicide. Right after Victor disappeared, Kay's mother, Catherine Miller, was murdered at her apartment. Eventually, Elsie Claxton would be convicted in Victor's murder and suspected in Catherine's murder, but never tried. Victor Gunnarsson tried to reinvent himself in small-town America, and instead found himself in a deadly love triangle. William Dathan Hulbert. He was an expat from western North Carolina who moved to an island called Bocas del Toro, off the coast of Panama. I became obsessed with how this small-time criminal from North Carolina decided to murder several people in his new home country. He had figured out that in Panama, you didn't need to have a lawyer present to sell your home. If you were in possession of the property deed and other corresponding paperwork, you were considered the owner. He first murdered a family living in a hostel that was for sale, took over their property, and began operating a robust social club for the local islanders out of it. He also murdered 2 other people for their homes. Because he was jovial and friendly, people let their guards down around William and never suspected him to be a murderer. He and his wife Laura were both sentenced to 47 and 26 years in Panamanian prison for their crimes. I could talk about rabbit holes related to true crime stories all day long. I'll end with a triple homicide that took place in July of 1966 in Hendersonville, North Carolina. That is when 2 men disposing of some tree limbs and brush discovered the deceased bodies of 2 men and 1 woman arranged in a semicircle off North Lake Summit Road. The victims had been bludgeoned to death and stabbed multiple times. The 2 men were Vernon Shipman and Charles Glass. They were well known in the small community of Hendersonville, as they worked together at a music store called Tempo Music Shop. Shipman, who was 43, also worked at the North Carolina Employment Security Commission. He and Charles Glass, age 36, bought the music store together, and Glass managed the day-to-day operations. The 2 men were known in town to be gay, which, if you can imagine the time period they were living in, caused all sorts of rumors to swirl when they were first reported missing. The female victim found with the 2 men was a woman named Louise Shoemate. She lived in Asheville, and she worked at Taylor Instrument Company in the town of Arden. She was 61, but her coworkers thought she was much younger. She kept to herself and lived in an apartment that didn't even have a phone. Louise enjoyed taking photographs in her spare time. Investigators theorized that Louise, out picking blueberries or taking photographs, had stumbled upon someone disposing of the 2 men's bodies and murdered her so she couldn't go to the police. I mentioned before how much these older cold cases are fascinating because of the lack of DNA testing available during that time period. But in this instance, you also have 2 gay men during a time when homosexuality was more polarizing, especially in the Deep South. And with a 3rd victim unrelated to the 2 men, how could anyone not be intrigued by this murder? In 2007, the retired police chief from Hendersonville stated publicly that he thought a man named Edward Thompson Jr. was responsible for the murders. In 1968, Thompson had embarked on a killing spree that included the rapes and murders of women in North Carolina and Virginia, and he had confessed to various people that he had murdered the 3 victims in Hendersonville. He died in prison without ever telling investigators whether he had murdered Vernon Shipman, Charles Glass, and Louise Shoemate. You can learn more about this case in episode 28, Unresolved in North Carolina. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Missing in the Carolinas. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and give it a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you'd also like to support the show in a small way, you can buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com, Renee Robertson. Thank you so much for those who have already supported me through this platform. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, so please like our pages and get started on a discussion of the missing people and unsolved cases profiled on the show. Do you know of a missing persons case in North or South Carolina that you think should be covered? Email me at missinginthecarolinas@gmail.com with any details you can share. Cover art for this podcast was designed by Macintosh Multimedia. Sound editing is provided by Daniel Robertson. Thanks so much for listening.